The joint operation of availability and representativeness. The representativeness and availability heuristics sometimes operate in tandem. For example, a judgment that two things belong together, that one is representative of the other, can make an instance in which they do occur together readily available, that is, easy to bring to mind as evidence that the two things belong together. The joint effect of these two heuristics can thus create an illusory correlation between two variables, or the belief that they are correlated when in fact they are not. A judgment of representativeness leads us to expect an association between the two entities, and this expectation in turn makes instances in which they are paired unusually memorable. A classic set of experiments by Lauren and Jean Chapman, 1967, highlights how readily people form illusory correlations and how consequential they can be. The Chapmans were struck by a paradox observed in the practice of clinical psychology. Clinicians often claim that they find so-called projective personality tests helpful in making clinical diagnoses, but systematic research has shown most of these tests to be completely lacking in validity. Projective tests require people to respond to unstructured and ambiguous stimuli, such as the famous Rorschach ink blots, thus projecting their personalities onto what they see. Why would intelligent, conscientious, and well-trained clinicians believe that such tests can diagnose mental or emotional problems when they cannot? Why, in other words, do some clinicians perceive an illusory correlation between their clients' conditions and their clients' responses on such tests? To find out, the Chapmans first asked numerous clinicians about which of their clients' specific test responses tended to indicate the presence of which specific pathological conditions. Much of their work focused on the Draw a Person test, in which the client draws a picture of a person, and the therapist interprets the picture for signs of various psychopathologies. The clinicians reported that they observed many connections between particular drawings and specific conditions, drawings and pathologies that seem intuitively to belong together. People suffering from paranoia, for example, were thought to be inclined to draw unusually large or small eyes. People excessively insecure about their intelligence were thought to be likely to draw a large or small head. To investigate these illusory correlations further, the Chapmans gathered a sample of 45 Draw a Person pictures, 35 drawn by psychotic patients in a nearby hospital, and 10 drawn by graduate students in clinical psychology. They then attached a phony statement to each picture that supposedly described the condition of the person who drew it. Some came with the description, is suspicious of other people, others with the description, has had problems of sexual impotence, and so on. The researchers were careful to avoid any correlation between the nature of the drawings and the condition attached to each one. For example, is suspicious of other people appeared just as often on pictures with average eyes as on pictures with large or small eyes. These pictures, with accompanying pathologies, were then shown to college students who had never heard of the Draw a Person test. Although the study was carefully designed so there was no connection between the pictures and specific conditions, the students nonetheless saw the same relationships reported earlier by the clinical psychologists. To the students, too, it seemed that prominent eyes were more likely to have been drawn by individuals who were suspicious of others. This finding suggests, of course, that the clinical psychologists were not detecting any real correlations between pathological conditions and responses on the Draw a Person test. Instead, they were detecting the same non-existent associations that the undergraduate students were seeing, illusory correlations produced by the availability and representativeness heuristics working together. Certain pictures seem representative of specific pathologies, for example, prominent eyes and being suspicious of other people, and therefore instances in which the two are observed together, a suspicious individual drawing a person with large eyes, are particularly noteworthy and memorable. In a final study, the Chapmans asked another group of students to indicate the extent to which various conditions, suspiciousness, impotence, dependence, called to mind different parts of the body, eyes, sexual organs, mouth. Tellingly, their responses matched the correlations reported by the earlier groups of clinicians and students. In addition to highlighting the joint influence of availability and representativeness, these findings exemplify a much broader point about human judgment. When associations or propositions seem plausible, people often believe them, regardless of the evidence. Looking back, two mental systems guide our judgments and decisions, one akin to intuition and the other akin to reason. The intuitive system operates quickly and automatically, while the rational system tends to be more deliberate and controlled. These systems can lead to the same judgments or to opposite judgments, or the intuitive system may produce a satisfying judgment so quickly that the rational system is never engaged. The quick assessments made by the intuitive system are often based on heuristics, which can sometimes bias judgment. The availability heuristic may lead to biased assessments of risk and biased estimates of people's contributions to joint projects. The representativeness heuristic may result in neglecting base rate information and lead to mistaken assessments of cause and effect. When these two heuristics operate together, they can lead to an illusory correlation between two variables. Chapter Review Summary. Studying social cognition. By studying errors in judgment, psychologists can understand how people make judgments and learn what can be done to avoid mistakes. The information available for social cognition. Sometimes people make judgments on the basis of very little information, such as making personality judgments based on physical appearance. Mistaken inferences can arise from pluralistic ignorance, which tends to occur when people are reluctant to express their misgivings about a perceived group norm. Their reluctance in turn reinforces the false norm. People's judgments can seem to them more accurate than they really are because of the self-fulfilling prophecy. More specifically, people can draw mistaken inferences about others that seem valid because they act in ways that elicit the very behavior they were expecting, behavior that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Information received secondhand often does not provide a full account of what happened, instead stressing certain elements at the expense of others. Negative information is more likely to be reported than positive information, which can lead people to believe they are more at risk of various calamities than they actually are. How information is presented. The way information is presented, such as the order of presentation, can affect judgment. A primacy effect arises when the information presented first is more influential because it affects the interpretation of subsequent ambiguous information. A recency effect arises when information presented last is more influential, often because it is more available in memory. Order effects are a type of framing effect. Other framing effects involve a change of the language or structure of the information presented to create a desired effect. The temporal framing of an event can also influence how it is interpreted. Far-off events are construed in more abstract terms, whereas imminent events are construed more concretely. Construal level theory. How we seek information. People tend to examine whether certain propositions are true by searching for information consistent with the proposition in question. This confirmation bias can lead people to believe things that aren't true because evidence can generally be found to support even the most questionable propositions. People are sometimes motivated to find evidence supporting a pre-existing conclusion, and so they do so disproportionately, coming to the conclusion that their preferred conclusion is more valid than it really is. Top-down processing, using schemas to understand new information. Schemas influence the interpretation of information. They are important top-down tools for understanding the world, as opposed to the bottom-up processing of information from the world. Schemas guide attention, memory, and the construal of information, and they can directly prompt behavior. Being exposed to certain stimuli, such as a plastic shovel, often has the effect of priming the concepts with which they're associated, the beach, making these concepts momentarily more accessible. In general, the more recently and the more frequently a schema has been activated, the more likely it is to be applied to new information. Conscious awareness of a schema is not required for it to have an influence. Reason, intuition, and heuristics. People have two systems for processing information, an intuitive system and a rational system. Intuitive responses are based on rapid associative processes, whereas rational responses are based on slower, rule-based reasoning. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that provide people with sound judgments most of the time, although they sometimes lead to errors in judgment or cognitive biases. People use the availability heuristic when judging the frequency or probability of some event by how readily relevant instances come to mind. It can cause people to overestimate their own contributions to group projects, and it can lead to faulty assessment of the risks posed by memorable hazards. The sense of fluency people experience when processing information can influence the judgments they make about it. Disfluent stimuli lead to more reflective thought. People use the representativeness heuristic when trying to categorize something by judging how similar it is to their conception of the typical member of a category. or when trying to make causal attributions by assessing how similar an effect is to a possible cause. Sometimes this leads people to overlook highly relevant considerations, such as base rate information, how many members of the category there are in a population. Operating together, availability and representativeness can produce potent illusory correlations, which result from thinking that two variables are correlated, both because they resemble each other and because the simultaneous occurrence of two similar events stands out more than that of two dissimilar events.